as well, before this came along, if I can ask you all, before this came along, one sort of political strand that was developing as being the way forward, for want of a better expression, was that basically our culture was going to become economically more to the left and culturally and socially in security terms more to the right. I'm being crude here, but I think that was the the newly formed SDP. I think that's their kind of selling point. Don't you think, in a way, that the role of the state, as it's been in this crisis, helps that kind of new political tradition along?
Well, certainly, Dominic Cummings was also a very great champion of this. And when you saw Rishi Sunak coming out with this unimaginable rescue package for the country, 80% of salary guaranteed for furloughed, then coming out and saying if you're self-employed, we'll also give you 80% of your last 3 years salary averaged out. That was something which no one could ever have imagined a Conservative government doing, and that was again part of this new blue Labour almost Tory Party appealing to the red wall. And I think that was done deliberately, also knowing that they need to also placate their newfound voters as well as being in the national interest. But then as it went on, you do begin to think, well, actually now, how many of their manifesto pledges can they maintain? How much can they do for the red wall in other areas now that public finances are going to be, depleted in fighting coronavirus? And so that's going to be a very interesting question to see precisely how will the government be able to meet the needs and anxieties and prove themselves to former Labour voters in that red wall.
Would you say, Marc Littlewood, that that basically, as somebody, a great free marketeer as yourself, a libertarian, I mean, would you say that it's something that you would not welcome, a greater role for the state? I mean, I know you said earlier that, in some ways it does give you pause for thought, but do you think that this is a game changer in that way?
Listen, this period that we're living through is going to be a game changer, but I think it is too early to say in what direction. I don't think that the lesson we're likely to derive from this, I'd be highly surprised, is that an efficient long-term way to run your economy is that the government underwrites 80% of everybody's salary in the private sector. You can do that for 6 weeks or 8 weeks at colossal expense, but you cannot do it in perpetuity. What's interesting about the state intervention that we're seeing here, economically and in terms of civil liberties, is precisely that it is exceptional. I haven't heard anybody really step forward yet, apart from some of the more ludicrous elements of Extinction Rebellion, and suggesting that what we're going through at the moment is a model of utopia, about how we would love to live our lives forevermore. Far from it. It's a miserable way to be living. It's an extraordinary circumstance. It is, I hope to God, a very short-term circumstance. But the idea that these sort of measures could be continued forever, and that what we've practiced in, if you like, wartime is going to become the norm in peacetime, I'm not sure that's right at all. We might, in fact, see a way that we snap right out of that. I mean, in fact, fiscal policy as a government tool is going to be a very hard lever to pull over the next 5 years. The cupboard's going to be bare. We have hurtled the economy into even more debt to deal with this. I'm not saying it was necessarily wrong to do so, but that is what we have done. The idea that in a year or 2 or 3's time, you'll be able to say, it's simple to know what the solution is to try and sabotage growth. It's more government spending, when we have, God knows what the size of the national debt will be, I think is for the birds. So it might actually be where, if you like, using old-fashioned big Keynesian economic tools right now, and it might even be that right now is exactly the sort of time you should be using those tools. But I'm not so sure that you should derive long-term lessons from it. In fact, when we exit this, I'm speculating here rather than predicting, I think you might see that people are yearning for their freedoms back. And one interesting phenomenon that my own institute has been looking into and will continue to work around is actually in some areas, counterintuitively, if you will, the government's actually liberalised. There have been certain areas of regulation, for example, the number of hours that truckers can be on the road over any given 24-hour period, or the times of day and night that supermarkets can take deliveries, or the planning permission that's needed for a restaurant to operate a takeaway service. This goes on and on and on. But we've ripped up to allow people to cut through red tape in order to act more efficiently in this time of national emergency. Well, I think that's going to actually point up a whole vast range of regulations that were never needed, and that I hope we can keep off the statute books in order to aid the bounce back. So just because we're going through this period, I don't think it's a reason to believe that it's going to become anything like the new norm. In fact, there may very well be a reaction to it. The point of this period is it is extraordinary, it is exceptional, it is a short-term response to an immediate sort of national existential crisis. It isn't the new normal. It can't be. You cannot have the government picking up 80% of the private sector wage bill ad infinitum. In fact, you can't really do it for many more than a few weeks. So whatever's practiced now, we're going to have to practice almost the opposite in order to actually get economic growth back into the economy, and in order to actually see a meaningful bounce back and to recover that hypothetical 35% drop off in GDP ASAP is going to, I think, require a much more market liberal approach rather than yet more government spending.
I mean, Marc, does that resonate with you, the idea that somehow this is, as Marc says, hugely untypical, but that it might lead to permanent change economically along left-wing lines? I mean, does this...
It's a worry. Look, I think the evidence shows that when you come out of a catastrophe like this, if you want to grow your economy very fast and pick it up again, which we desperately need to do, if only to pay off the enormous amount of debt we just accumulated, never mind replace all the businesses and jobs that we've just killed. If you want to do that, what you need, in fact, is a sort of free market solution. You need low taxes, low regulation. You need to let rockets be put on the economy. Now, interestingly, after the Second World War, that happened rather more in Germany than it did in Britain. Britain limped on with rationing and government controls that were hangovers from wartime. And it took us rather a long time to come back. Germany, in West Germany at least, obviously not in the East, West Germany had more of an economic miracle and recovered rather faster despite the absolute devastation it went through, because it understood that. After the Great Depression, it was the other way around. Britain did rather better than America with low taxes, and sort of a cutting back of the cost of the state, whereas there's quite a lot of evidence that aspects of the New Deal in America really extended the crisis and its cost to the population. But of course, those were very popular. And I worry that the sort of state aid that we're seeing now is going to lead us more in that sort of New Deal direction, whatever the economic costs may be. And I worry too that politically that is going to change the complexion of things, because we'll get into a bidding war between the Tories and Labour over who does the most government intervention, and Labour will win that. I think the narrative that's gone now is that the Tories were going to be in power for 10 years. I think Labour could easily win the next election in this vastly uncertain world.